everyone, it's Rena. So this video is for Gemini parents as well as those who have Gemini children. And I hope that you can find some of the things that I have compiled on my list as being resonant with what you're dealing with. And the point of this is simply to show how different sun signs parent differently and how they approach parenthood, and also how children vary as represented by the sun signs. I actually compiled this list on my own. I didn't use any kind of outside resource. And there's probably a lot more I could have gone into if I had looked at different sites and seen what they said, or looked at some of my books. But I just wanted to do it off the top of my head, and I organized my thoughts. Before I continue, I must say that I am not a parent, and I realize that for some people, that's going to make me seem like I'm just, like I don't know what I'm talking about. And, you know, I do have extensive courses, college courses in child development, but I realize that that is not equivalent to actually raising children day in and day out. So I acknowledge that, but I do feel that children are people too. I have been a child. I do know what it's like to experience some of the things that children go through, and I feel that we have to treat children as equals. A lot of people will not agree with that, you know, especially people who are more authoritarian in their belief system about the relationship between parents and children. There are definitely people out there who think that adults are more, I don't know if they would say that they are more important than children, but that they have a lot more say and a lot more wisdom and things like that. And I mean, to a certain degree, they may be correct, but I do think that there is a lack of respect given to children across the board. And this leads some adults to hit children, even if it's not like really hard. I just think that it's wrong, that it creates more problems, and it doesn't solve any. I was going to say that it doesn't solve problems. And I think that, think about yourself. Are you ever a brat as an adult? Do you ever have your moments where you're not doing what you should do? What about if another adult slapped you? It wouldn't be acceptable. It's actually called battery. And even if it's simple battery, it's still battery. Well, you know, children have the right to not be hit. And, you know, I just feel like there are other ways to deal with children when they are not doing what you want them to do. So I want this video to kind of go into how parents approach raising children based on their sun sign, as well as the attributes of the child of a particular sun sign. With Gemini, we're talking about a sign that is a mutable air sign. So there's a lot of flexibility with Gemini people, children and adults alike. This makes them very versatile. They may have a lot of interests. And the parent is going to be probably, I would say, not a typical authoritarian type of parent. They're going to be probably more laid back in a lot of ways, because when you're flexible, you don't have this rigid ideology of this is how children, you know, children should be seen and not heard and stuff like that. I think a lot of times air sign parents are pretty progressive. Same with fire sign. I think the water and the earth sign parents are more traditionalists. And I think that the air sign parents are pretty laid back. They may treat the child as an equal, and this can go both ways. I'm right now I'm talking about the positive traits of a Gemini parent. I will say that you have to acknowledge that your child is in fact a child, because you could expect too much of them if you don't. I remember being on the bus, and I heard this mother talking to her child, and the child was very small, and she was speaking to the child with, the way she would speak to another adult, in a very advanced intellectual sort of way. And I thought that it was, grossly inappropriate, and that the child was not vibing with the parent because of this. The parent didn't have the capacity to adjust their dialogue at a level. I'm not talking about dumbing it down and saying, "Oh, aren't you?" Being like baby talk, but somewhere in between, where you kind of like simplify, but you still are acknowledging that. So it can go both ways. But being verbal with children is really a big deal, and they have seen the differences in different cultural groups, and some groups do not interact with their children very much at all, and those children enter school with a stunted vocabulary compared to the children whose parents are usually, more well educated, and they have a bigger vocabulary, but they also are just naturally more verbal, intellectually curious, and they pass that on to their child because they're constantly speaking to their child and stimulating their child's mind, vocabulary, adding to their vocabulary. That is a really great way to prepare your child, but do it in a naturalistic way. Not, I've seen the same thing. I didn't write this down, but I was just thinking about this. Conversely, if you think, I want my child to go to Harvard, so I'm going to start drilling my child and having these fake conversations with them that are just meant to try to force information into them. And I see that too, based on where I happen to live, where these parents are like, they just want their child to succeed so much that they're like not being genuine in their discussions. And I think the child can sense that at some level. And the child may clam up. The child may kind of rebel, even at a young age, because the kind of intellectual stimulation that they're being given is contrived. It's not like flowing naturally. And the child may feel like they're being forced to do this, and then they won't like it. So there has to be a happy medium where you're not like using information, knowledge, education as kind of like a club, to club the child with. You want a child to love learning for the sake of it, not so they can get into an Ivy League school. But going back to the positive things, treating the child as an equal, what I mean is not talking down to them, not like kind of patronizing them, but, treating them as a human being that has a brain, has ideas, and really sharing ideas with the child. Varied experiences. Gemini is a sign that has multiple interests, and they have like a big tent with which to go from one interest to the next, and exposing the child to all of these things. That is so great because it creates more context. When you're a young child, if you get to travel, if you get to have interactions with people, different types of people, the more variety and stimulation you get, it can make the child more sophisticated. And I think that is receptive, that makes them more receptive to learning as well. This kind of parent tends to love reading, and they will model that for the child, which is great because then the child wants to read. Children tend to emulate the parents, whatever the parent is doing. So you can either be doing a stupid thing as a parent, and you've seen those things on YouTube where these children you could tell they're imitating how the parents talk, and they're being real sassy, and it can be funny to see how they're acting, but you know that they're modeling the parents' behavior. They're kind of imitating it. And, but reading and because Geminis are eternally curious, they will not be irritated when the child asks a bunch of questions. They will love that part of the child, and they will kind of stoke the child's curiosity. I get so mad when I am out and about and I hear a child asking a parent, "Why is this? What's this?" And the parent's just looking at their phone and they're kind of snapping at the child, and they don't want to say anything because they're not really engaged with life in a curious kind. They're not really curious about life, so they just see it as an annoyance that the child is curious, and that is so tragic because it doesn't matter how much money you have. If you are somebody who can simply, even if you don't know the answer to the question, say, let's go to the library or let's look online and find out what the answer is. That can be really a great way to kind of encourage the child to ask more questions rather than being this person who kind of like treats the child like their questions are an irritation. That all that does is discourage the child from future questions and curiosity. And it's such a great opportunity to kind of like stoke their interest in life itself. So that's kind of like something that I think Gemini parents are really good at, is that they're just willing to answer questions. Let's go research the question and things like that. Gemini adults or parents are very witty. They're fun-loving, they just have a great sense of humor. And that, I think kids like that, and instead of being overly serious, that can be a drag. So having that kind of funny take on things can be nice for the child. And open-mindedness. Like I said, being flexible, being open-minded, being willing to change your mind, being willing to consider another person's point of view. Those are important things. I don't think we really value them nearly enough. Now let's talk about some of the not so hot characteristics. Gemini has been known. I put down having a split personality, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I don't know if it's that there's like a persona that is actually like really bad or anything like that, but there might be. I mean, especially if the parent was abused when they were a child and they have like a part of them that is a little bit more in shadow. But regardless, there's an inconsistency sometimes with Gemini, and children really thrive with consistent behavior and treatment, okay? A consistent lifestyle. If the parent is kind of all over the place, then the child doesn't have that sense of being able to expect certain things. So there may be a bit of a chaotic feel to their upbringing. There can be too much detachment, again, depending on how the Gemini parent was raised. If they experienced trauma, including neglect is a form of abuse. even if it wasn't meant maliciously. I mean, even if the parent has an addiction and they don't feed their child all the time, that's still a form of abuse. And that can stay with the parent and can make them less able to understand, how to raise children properly. So they may not really even see the need to do certain things that are really important, like having a very regular bedtime, meal times, and things like that. I didn't realize that this was important, but children are they thrive with routines. And, when we're adults, we might stay up until 2 a.m. and we might not eat until noon or something like that. And we can kind of wing it. But children are developing, and it just works out the best for them like that, from what I have read. And so if the parent is kind of like, whatever, doesn't seem to see the need for that, and they're like indifferent to some of these issues. Some of it too could be because as an air sign, they're kind of abstract. They're in the mind. They may not be grounded enough thinking about the body to take care of those bodily things, even with themselves, let alone their child. So they may just be kind of living in their heads a lot. And I actually put flaky because that can be along the same lines of, I think that's more related to the inconsistencies of, not being like regular in their habits, and then kind of like maybe being too impulsive sometimes, and that can lead to flaking out on people, like not keeping their promises to their child, that can be problematic for children, because then they don't trust if the parent promises them something and then they don't deliver. I think that Geminis are prone to anxiety, racing thoughts. Part of it, being ruled by Mercury is probably a large part of this. And also being an air sign, you've got a 1-2 punch there. And so, or just thinking too much in general, where overthinking things, obsessing about certain things, and just in general, I think a Mercury can make a person high-strung. And, when somebody's high-strung, they can impart that anxiety onto their child, whether, in a very subtle sort of a way without saying a word. So that kind of thing, just through your vibes. So anyway, I also would say sarcastic. Sometimes a Gemini is funny, witty, but sometimes it's at the expense of somebody else, or not necessarily just putting them down very directly, but just their tone of voice. And children a lot of times cannot understand sarcasm, and they will take it to heart, and they will think that you are trying to humiliate them. And so there can be like an insensitivity where the Gemini parent doesn't tune into how the child will receive this kind of interaction. And, sometimes when somebody's sarcastic, they're saying something like the opposite of what really they mean. And the child might not understand that, because children tend to be very literal. And it takes time for them to understand the nuances and to get, and including, the tone of voice, to know that it's, that they're being sarcastic. But it's also, it can be a form of passive aggression where the parent is really like miffed at the child, but they're not the type to just directly express anger. And I would say Geminis can be like that. But then the child does perceive the negativity that is underlying that verbal exchange. And so that can be unpleasant for the child. So it's not very, the child isn't going to necessarily feel very good about that. Okay, let's talk about some of the Gemini child's traits. The Gemini child will typically be very highly intelligent and may even be, what's that term that starts with a P, precocious. I didn't write this down, but I just thought of this. Precocious. Like kind of a little adult because of their verbal skills at a young age. And they could be the teacher's pet. They can, the teacher may like them because they feel that they're like more advanced. They get the work. They're good in school typically. They can be the class clown though, and this can be like problematic because they may be disruptive. They may have a hard time shutting up in school. And so school may be like kind of a double-edged sword where they're very intelligent and they like school, but they have a hard time sitting still and they have a hard time keeping their mouth shut. And so you and the teacher are probably going to have to figure out some game plan because like the way schools are set up nowadays, which I don't agree with, since I have observed in many schools, and not recently because I'm not studying it anymore, but when I was, they had like tables. They didn't have individual desks anymore. And I could go into a whole spiel about why I think they're doing that. They also had to share their school supplies, which I think that's absolutely atrocious, because it was so fun to have our own desks. And they, when I was going to school in the 70s, that was when they started having more communal type of learning. There was a lot of experimentation in the 70s with education. And I remember that was the first time when they put my desk with other kids. And being a Sagittarian, I was like the Gemini, always getting in trouble for talking. So that may make it worse that now they have this big table, because a Gemini kid is very social and extroverted and also can have ADD. I think it's probably very commonplace for a Gemini individual, child or adult, to have ADD, and therefore it's very hard for them to focus. This brings me to a very important point, and this has to do with any child that you have. If you're listening for Gemini child, or whoever's listening to this who has a child, it's important not to place expectations on a child that they have to perform academically in a certain way. Because as somebody who has worked with children who have special needs, or, who are in special education, I know that especially nowadays, there's so much going on in that area, and you would never know by looking at a child that they could have certain things going on with them cognitively. And besides the fact, even with ADD, which I think is probably a lot more common these days for various reasons, some parents assume that the child is just being careless. I was never diagnosed with ADD, but I do believe that I have it. And I mean the classic sense. Not just, for any old reason, but really I can tell. And losing things, forgetting to bring home the permission slips and all that stuff. Don't yell at your child for something like that, because they can't help it. They literally, their brains are literally wired in a different way. And it doesn't make them intellectually inferior. If anything, they could be highly intelligent. But it's not one size fits all. And so one of the things that is so important is to tailor your child's particular way of learning, of interacting with life, to best help them to succeed, instead of trying to get them to fit into something that's like a cookie cutter type of a deal. If you notice some of these things that I'm talking about, don't assume that they just don't care, or that they're just doing it for some reason. Nobody forgets things on purpose, unless they really don't want you to see a note that the teacher sent. But you know what I mean. They're doing it because their minds were focused on something else at that moment and they forgot. And the more that you can accept your child's differences, the better, because these are children that can be highly successful academically, but they may have certain things that hold them down a little bit, including a lack of focus and being high-strung themselves. And this may cause them to have difficulty staying calm. They may be more like prone to kind of like restlessness and things like that. So I would say, just like I said with Aries children, is to give them a lot of time for physical recreation, so that they can get out all of their energy into some kind of physical activity. And don't just allow them to be the reader or or be on the computer. As a matter of fact, I think it's better for young children not to be on the computer very much at all, because interacting with the natural world is a great way for them to really stimulate their senses and take in information in a very sensory sort of way, especially when they're younger, the younger grades. They're very much, and early childhood, that's how children learn. And machines, I think, don't help that process. So being able to get them to be in nature and to exercise, because they may like to walk, so walk with them, hike with them, do whatever it takes to get them to expend their energy in a physical sort of way. And realize that they are verbal. So, they may tend to blurt things out. They're not trying to be naughty per se. They may just have a hard time keeping their mouths shut. So there are ways to kind of help that along. And, it's all good as long as you can be sensitive to their needs. That's the important thing, is not to treat all children the same. Okay, that's what I have for you. If you are interested in a private reading, the link to my website is below. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.